All right, so if you can't hear me, you're deaf. All right, this is not going to be here. So this is the night of the second presidential debate, and if it is a town hall forum, so we have no clue what people are going to ask, and it could come down to, well, as in the past, boxers or briefs. But if we're serious about looking into the future and talking about issues that matter, one of the core issues is going to be what happens with entitlements. In particular, what happens with the big three: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Why is this such a crucial issue? Well, the basic number that you want to keep in mind is $100 trillion. This is the unfunded liabilities faced under these programs. Plus or minus a few trillion, it's not an exact science. But this is the shortfall that the government has in terms of projected revenue versus projected costs. Now, $100 trillion is more money than we can really imagine. So just to give you some sense of the scale of the problem that we're facing. This is a scale model, some of you may have seen this, of a guy next to stacks of $100 bills adding up to $1 billion. That, and if you can see in the far left-hand corner, is that same person to scale with $1 trillion. So 100 of those at today's present values. That's the shortfall we're facing. Now, the problem gets even worse when we look at the fact that nobody has a real plan to do anything about them. Indeed, the only politician who's put forward any sort of plan has been basically demonized. Now, this is a picture right here of Paul Ryan, who now is Mitt Romney's VP selection. Does anybody want to guess what horrendous number, take Social Security, that Paul Ryan's plan would cut Social Security by? How much would Paul Ryan's proposal cut Social Security? 70 billion? In Washington, they don't even, that's less than a decimal place. No, zero. In fact, it actually grows Social Security spending from 4.75% of GDP to 6%. And this is the plan for which that Ryan has been, condemned as an enemy of the safety net, wanting to throw old people out into the street. The problem is we have to cut entitlements. The current promises can't be kept. And yet nothing is being done. And why is that? Why is it that this problem, and everybody agrees it's a problem? The analogy I use is you walk into a hospital and there's a bunch of doctors surrounding somebody who's bleeding out on the floor, and they just go, well, obviously something needs to be done, but nobody's doing a thing. That's really what's going on. And why is that? Well, the basic issue, not a real question, but I will have real questions. Thank you, though. I like enthusiasm. What the heck? Let's go for it.
No, why would people admit that there's a problem with entitlement spending and not want to do anything about entitlements is because people like entitlements. They don't want to lose what, especially senior citizens. It's hard to tell them that what they've worked for, they can no longer have as much money or as much, basically receiving as much money as they were told a long time ago.
Yeah, so the answer she gave, and this is, I assume most of you heard it, but just for the people on the live stream at least, is basically, you can't cut entitlements because people really like getting them, right? But on the other hand, entitlements are costing the average American family $29,000 a year to pay for those entitlements. $29,000 a year. That's the difference between being able to live in a low crime neighborhood or being able to live or having to live in a high crime neighborhood. It's the difference between being able to send your kid to college or not being able to. Between being able to leave your job and maybe pursue your dreams versus saying, I got to stay here because otherwise I can't pay the bills. So I think there's some truth to what you're saying. But it's also not even true that people just vote their narrow, supposed financial self-interest. I come from California. And if there's anything Californians prove, it's that we do not vote our financial self-interest. We'll vote for any tax increase, any regulation that will raise our energy costs, anything, if we think that it's right, if we think that morally this is proper and that the alternative would be disastrous. And so this is exactly what's going on in entitlements. That there's a certain story, a certain narrative that people have been told, which is that, look, anybody who wants to cut entitlements is basically throwing poor, needy people out into the street to fend for themselves, and that would be a disaster and a moral corruption. That's the framework in which we've been taught to think about entitlements. And what I want to talk about tonight is why that framework is 100% wrong. 100% wrong. That story we've been told is false from beginning to end, 100%, every single element. I could use more synonyms, but the point I'm trying to get across is that it's not at all true. In fact, I'm going to go further than that. It's actually the opposite. The opposite is that these programs are morally corrupt and that we should get rid of them. Now, I know you might be thinking, that doesn't even compute. What is he talking about? We'll get there. Basically, this is our plan, and I'm only going to speak for about half an hour, and then I want to open it up to your questions. But basically, I want to look at A, why we don't need an entitlement state. B, why it's actually immoral and destructive. And C, briefly, I want to talk about how if you agree and you think this is actually a negative, not a positive, in today's political system, some tips on how to fight it. But first, let's get clear. What do we mean by entitlements? So I'm giving a whole talk about entitlements. We better make sure we're on the same page about this, right? An entitlement is basically and there's different terminology and there's technical terminology, but the way I use it is any program in which the government is guaranteeing a product or service, not on the basis of your ability to pay, but on the basis of your need. So generally what happens when we want something? Like we go to the store, there's a gallon of milk, we give the grocer some money that we earn doing work. It's a trade, right? Well, entitlement's different. Entitlement says, no, it's not that you earned wealth and now you're trading it. It's that you basically are getting something surely because you need it and the government's going to guarantee it. And I mentioned that applies to the big three, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, but it is a much wider phenomenon. It includes every sort of anti-poverty program, of which there are dozens, everything from food stamps to unemployment. It includes public education. Public education says if you get, it's not that you have to pay to get an education, you're entitled to an education simply because that's something that you need. Farm subsidies, I mean, the list is really, unfortunately, endless today. But the basic issue is a guarantee based on need, not based on trade. So, been there, done that. Why we have entitlements? Well, the idea is basically that without them, in one way or another, people would starve in the streets. That in a world without entitlements, people's crucial needs wouldn't be met. And of course, nobody wants to live in that world. I don't want to live in that world. I'm sure none of you want to live in the world, in such a world. If it was really true that there would be mass impoverishment and people really struggling and unable to cope, that would be a nightmare. But what's really ignored, and what's saliently ignored in the whole debate, is that we've actually run this experiment. Entitlements, we sometimes treat them as if these programs have always existed and therefore we can't question them because they will always exist. But in fact, we didn't really get our first entitlement program in this country until, anybody want to give a year? 35. Social Security Act is passed. And even that played a relatively minor role in the lives of most Americans. Really, we didn't get an entitlement culture. We didn't get major programs that played a major role in a major portion of the population's lives until the 60s. This is within the living memory of many Americans. So what we should expect to find then, right, is if this entitlement narrative is true, what we should expect to find if we look at America before the entitlement state is disaster, need, starvation, really, really bad stuff. So, is that what we see? It ain't. So, let's set some historic context. So, What we're really going to be talking about for the next 10 minutes or so is the period from really 1865, so the end of the Civil War, until 1935. Now, for those historians among you who know this, you'll know there were, particularly at the local level, some minor government aid to the poor and things like this, but it was very minor, it was very exceptional. But this is basically an era without entitlements. There's no Social Security, no Medicare, none of this stuff. What was life like? Well, the key thing is to remember is that for most of mankind's history, basically up until roughly 1800, stagnation. Sometimes, we'll eke up a little bit in our standard of living. Sometimes we'll collapse a little bit. But basically it's flat until we get, for the first time in human history, economic freedom and something approaching free market capitalism. And that's what this line is. This is for the first time in history we start to see around 1800, instead of people living the same way that their great-grandfather and their great-great-grandfather did, life is improving. Slow at first, but it's starting to gain steam. Economic freedom is unleashing a wave of innovation, and suddenly the world that you're born into looked a lot poorer than the world that is there at the end. That people are becoming better off. And this is the key thing. This is the first point I really want to hammer home, particularly if you're at all on the right side of the political spectrum. And I don't mean the correct side, although I think it's the correct side. I mean, if you're on the political right, oftentimes when this whole discussion of entitlements comes up, the first thing that'll pop out of somebody's mouth if they're in my position is, hey, don't worry, there's private charity. That is not at all the starting point. The starting point to remember is that in a world without entitlements, and this is what happened in America, most people don't need entitlements. Most people, they have, freedom means that you have to take responsibility for your own life, and people do take responsibility for their own lives. Most people support themselves through productive work. And that was what was really going on, is that during this time, most people worked, found jobs, and their standard of living improved. If you look at the average worker's income over the 19th century, what happens to it? Did it stagnate? No. It actually more than quadrupled. This is unprecedented in human history. The idea that a standard of living within a span of 100 years could quadruple, nobody, for the average person, nobody had even imagined this was possible, and yet it was happening before people's eyes. This is the core of what's going on in the era before there's entitlements. I should add, the fact that wages are going up, this is happening in the context that prices are falling, steadily declining, new products are being introduced, and this is really interesting, the average number of working hours are plummeting. Over that span of 100 years, before all these, supposed pro-worker laws, the average number of hours worked by the worker is dropping from the 3,000s of hours a year to the 2,000s. We're becoming so productive that people are deciding to forego a little bit of extra money in order to enjoy more free time in their lives. This is something that is, I think, really spectacular, and we need to remember that's what life looked like for most Americans at the time. And a key statistic that I think drives this home, it was during this era that immigrants were what? Running away from the United States because we don't have entitlement programs? No, they were flocking here because this was the land of what? Handouts? No, it was the land of opportunity. And what was the opportunity? The opportunity was not that people were coming along and guaranteeing you a job or guaranteeing you a retirement or guaranteeing you health care. What they guaranteed was freedom. You could come to America, nobody would get in your way, and guess what? People flocked to America at rates of immigration that had never been seen before in history and have not been equaled since. My favorite example of this is the story of Andrew Carnegie. So Carnegie actually was a Scottish immigrant, came here when he was 12 with his family, and he got his first job. He had to go straight to work because they couldn't afford to send him to school. And he went to work at a loom factory, not a loom factory. I forget exactly what the factory was, but basically he started out making $1 a day. Oh, I joke. $1 a week. It was $1 a week, not $1 an hour, $1 a day, $1 a week. But he got his start, and he was able to gain skills and show his ability. And what is amazing about a free market, or a relatively free market as we had at that time, what is so cool about it is the fact that he starts getting promoted, he starts getting raises like that. Why? Because in a free market, it's in other people's selfish interest to keep you around if you're really good at what you do, to promote you, to make your life better off. If you're really good, because why? You're helping them make a lot of money. And so this Scottish immigrant without an education, without any start, who came here penniless, is able to rise to become one of the richest men in history. Now, this is definitely exceptional. Exceptional in its scale, in his scale of success. But the pattern is something that you see all the time during this era, which is people who they go out there, they hang up their shingle, and they make a modest success for themselves. Maybe they don't become the richest man in the country, but they live better than their father and their grandfathers did. So, if you're concerned with poverty, if you're concerned with people not having the economic goods that they need to live a full, rich life, then your first concern has to be guaranteeing the economic freedom that allows them to lift themselves out of that hardship. Not how to redistribute things other people have created. Now, you might think, hey, that's fine, that sounds great, most people fine, I gotcha, they did okay. But what about those who didn't? What about those who, for no fault of their own, felt on tough times? What happened to them in that era? So let's look at that. Did they starve in the streets? I'm going to spoiler alert you, but no. They did not starve in the streets. So the first thing that people did, remember, these are people who by and large are taking responsibility for their life. And if you're out there and you're taking responsibility for your life, you've got a job, you're working, what are you going to do to plan for your future? You know life could hand you some unexpected twists and turns. So what did people do? What did these responsible people do to protect themselves in case something went wrong? Well, by and large, there were two major things that they did. So first of all, they saved a relatively high proportion of their income. Didn't necessarily make a lot, but they knew that savings was their buffer against the future. It was their protection against the unknown, against bad luck, against getting sick, against losing a job. And so, just like in developing places such as China today, they saved a relatively high proportion of their income compared to what we do right now, which is basically nothing. They saved a lot. The other thing is they insured primarily through what were called mutual aid societies. So mutual aid societies were basically private voluntary organizations where you would join with some people like this, usually people that you knew, and you guys would all pay membership dues, and that would insure you against things like getting injured at work, getting sick, provide, for instance, death benefits for your family. The very things that we're told we need entitlement programs for today, people were privately and voluntarily providing for before we had an entitlement system. And it was far superior. It was superior from, I list 4 aspects here, but I want to stress 2, the ones I've named before. They're private. What does that mean? It means you're not shoved into one size fits all program. It means that, for instance, let's say I'm a bachelor and I don't really care what happens to me after I die. I don't have to pay for funeral benefits. Whereas for somebody who has a family and doesn't want to put them through hardship, he might think that's something that's really important to me. The level of health care I might want could differ. There was a lot of this, but the basic point is that it was voluntary. I only went into it if I judged it to be a good deal for me and my family. If I said, the cost and the benefits, yeah, I come out ahead in this deal. Today, do we have that option? Can you say, I opt out of Social Security? Well, you can't opt out of paying for it, that's for sure. We're coerced into these systems, and the advantage of mutual aid was precisely that this was something up to the voluntary choices of individuals to enter. This was not, by the way, this was not some kind of like insignificant phenomenon. These were the second largest institutions, most popular institutions in America in that era, setting aside only religions and churches. These were huge. When did they start to decline? And if anybody guesses 1935-ish, you're on the mark. Once government started supplanting these functions, these voluntary institutions started to fade away. And that's actually very sad, because one of the things I didn't mention is these were not just insurance institutions, these were also social institutions where you created a real sense of community among people. If anybody ever had a relative who was in an Elks Lodge or a Moose Lodge, I had a grandfather who was a Grand Poobah in one. I'm not sure what that meant in that era, except that they sat around and drank beer and he got to tell more stories than the other ones. But that's the kind of thing that was lost when everybody's herded into just basically a one-size-fits-all bureaucracy. Okay. You might be thinking, okay, fine, that's what most people did. But still, what about the people who, let's say, couldn't work, didn't have any savings, didn't have joined a mutual aid society, or let's say, they ran through their savings? What happened to them? Surely they must have starved in the streets. Wrong again. The key thing that went on during this time was assistance, but voluntary assistance. People who hit tough times in this era, they turned to friends, family, extended family, neighbors, co-workers, people who they knew and who valued them for help. And there was a large outpouring of help. I mean, it was not, there's a famous, tale of the time. If you're a farmer and your barn burned down, you'd be richer afterwards than before, just from the outpouring of support from your neighbors. And it wasn't only money. Oftentimes it would just be the kind of natural relationships, economic relationships that people would take for granted, which is, hey, Bill, work's been a little slow lately. Can I pay for my beef, in 2 weeks rather than right now? Yeah, sure, Joe. Go right ahead. That kind of thing is what occurred all the time. Now, let's assume you don't have any friends, you don't have any family, you don't have any savings, you can't work, nobody likes you. Finally, we must have met somebody who's going to starve in those darn lonely streets, right? No, I'm sorry to say that even those people, and this usually the people who had to take advantage, I'm talking about private charity now, even those people, there was an abundant amount of private charity. Most of the people who took part in it were actually recent immigrants, people who didn't have roots here, who hadn't yet, met other people and established relationships. They were able to take advantage of an abundant amount of private charity. There's a historian named Walter Tratner. He disagrees with me probably about everything. He writes history defending the entitlement state. But on this point, we definitely agree. He says you could go into any major city at the time and get a book 100 pages thick of the organizations that existed to feed people, to give them a place to stay, to give them clothing. Government wasn't there watching out for you, and people didn't want to live in a world where people were starving in the streets. And because of the wealth that capitalism was making possible, they could do something about it at relatively low cost to themselves. For less than 10% of my income, I can help make my community a better place to live. Sign me up. And that's exactly what went on. Meanwhile, you have to remember, this is at a time when government spending didn't eat up nearly half of your income in the first place. Federal government spending through the whole 19th century, except for the Civil War, never went above 3% GDP, and it was usually less. Today, add 0 to that, and you're getting closer to the real agenda. State and local spending were a bit more, so add on, it usually, it stayed around 6%, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more, again, accepting the Civil War. So 9% of your money was going to the government. You're living better than ever. throwing in a few percent to like help your neighbors, help your friends, help people suffering through no fault of their own. Americans, it's a historical fact. That's exactly what they did in the era before the entitlement state. So, if we did not need the entitlement state then, why would we need it now? How much easier would it be now when we're so rich that even poor Americans live better in many ways than rich Americans did then? There's some statistics on here that I'm sure the people in the live stream can't see. But most poor Americans have shelter. They have air conditioning. They have a car or multiple cars. No Americans, I would venture to say none, are poor by the World Bank standards. The World Bank defines poverty as living on $2 a day or less. In America, and this, I don't want to downplay the hardships. This is not meant to be a flip comment, but it's simply a fact that there's more than $2 a day in a trash can. Now, we shouldn't want to settle for that. Nobody wants to live in a culture where that's the norm, and thankfully for us, it's a huge exception. But there is hardship. There's not real poverty. And let's thank capitalism for that. And I should add, there would be a whole heck of a lot less than there is today if we had even more economic freedom. But I'll get to that shortly. Okay, so why? If it was such a paradise, Don, why in the world did we get an entitlement state? If it was so lovely, why in the world did it come about that we got Social Security, that we got Medicare, that we got Medicaid? Well, there's a lot to this story, but I'll give you the short version. In a word, ideology. Ideology. So you need to make a big distinction, and this was a distinction that was very often made at the time, between the deserving and the undeserving. The deserving poor, the ambitious poor, the responsible poor, they did well in a world without entitlements. Under capitalism, they prospered, and the people who didn't, because they suffered through no fault of their own, they were as well off as they could possibly be because the people who they depended on were able to prosper like never before. It didn't quite go so well for the unwilling. So the people who didn't want to work, the people who wanted to be taken care of at other people's expense, the people who in effect dug their own grave through their own bad choices, it was often observed at the time that there was almost a one-to-one correlation between being in long-term poverty and being an alcoholic. I mean, it was there was a lot of for people who, through their own choices, were not actually able to make a success of their lives. It was not the greatest system, right? Because now they could not force other people to help them. Now, did they even starve in the streets as an aside? No, they didn't. Not every charity would help them, but the ones that did often put very stringent conditions on it. They said, look, you don't have a right to this, and morally, you don't have a right to this. You're the one making these mistakes. However, if you agree to change, to support yourself to the extent you can, to live by our rules, we'll still help you out. Now, there were people who didn't like that. They said that is cruel. That is, it is wrong to distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving. If a person has a need, they said, well, you are your brother's keeper. And whether that need is the result of their choices or just bad luck, your job in life morally is to serve that need. And so instead of making these we need to get rid of this distinction. And that's why you very rarely hear it today. This distinction between, oh, well, that's deserving versus undeserving poor. The people who fought against this were the people who actually would go on to create the entitlement state, the progressives. And they said, the basic issue is, if you have a need, morally you're entitled to have it fulfilled by people who can, quote, afford it. So that establishes this principle. With Social Security, we get the principle that if a person has a need, morally, it's society's obligation, it's the obligation of those who are not lacking to fill it, whatever that need is, whatever the source of that need is. Now, it starts out relatively small, right? It starts off as very exceptional cases. Indeed, leading up to Social Security, there was very minor programs, I think even at the federal level, for widows and orphans, who, I mean, obviously are the most sympathetic people that would receive government benefits. Well, now we have a principle that says, need is a claim. So what happened is people go waving around their needs. And the progressives just keep pushing. They say, yeah, we're helping a lot of people, but we could be doing more. So we did a little bit more. Instead of just the really, really needy, we went to the really needy. And then said, well, shouldn't we do more? So we went to the just plain old needy. And today, there's people who make $20,000 a year who receive $20,000 a year on top of it in benefits. That is the way in which we've seen this expansion of the entitlement state. Now, whatever you call that, you can't call it progress. This is not the American system. The American system says that your life and your work and its products belong to you. That is the meaning of the Declarations of Independence, is guaranteed a life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In this country, your life belonged to you, and any wealth that you earn through your productive effort and through the voluntary trade in your dealings with others, that's yours by right, and nobody has a right to take it from you. But what do entitlements do? So I said that entitlements are government guarantees on the basis of need. Now, the government doesn't have any money. Where does the money come from? From taxpayers. And is that voluntary? Like, does the IRS come to your door each year, hat in hand, and say, would you like to donate to the Social Security Fund right now? No. I mean, it's taken from you. And if you don't pay it, believe me, they will pay you a visit and they will come and get it. This is morally impossible to distinguish from theft. It is, you earned it, and it's going to be taken from you and given to somebody who didn't earn it. Why? Because he needs it more than you. The analogy I would give, the way I think about it, is we often think about it as, well, but I'd like to, help people. Put yourself in the other position for a minute, though. You need help. Say you need a medical procedure that you can't afford. Do you go to your neighbor, gun in hand, and say, hey, you owe me. I have a need. Give me money. No, I don't think anybody in this room would do that. And if you would, well, feel free to make yourself known. But no, I mean, I'll tell you what I would do. I would go there and I'd say, hey, look, I've hit really tough times. I know, you have plans for your money, but if you could help me, I deeply appreciate it. But the entitlement state is based on the other premise, right? The entitlement state says that if you went up there gun in hand, you'd be in the right. And the guy saying, no, I have better plans for my money, he'd be wrong. That is the morality that's at essence here. Now, there's a tendency to really think about the entitlements as, well, they're kind of nice programs. If we could afford them, that would be great. So how do we make them affordable? But what I want to really get across is just the sheer destructiveness of them. So let's take one example and kind of work through it a little bit. So take Social Security. Now take a world without entitlements. How do you prepare for retirement? So a rational person, when he's working, a responsible person during his working years, he thinks carefully. He thinks, what do I want my life to be about? What do I want it to look like? And in part of that, it's thinking about, what do I want to do in my later years? Do I want to retire? Maybe I love my job and I just want to keep doing it until I drop dead. Maybe then I'm just going to set aside an emergency fund, but I'm not going to, invest too heavily now. Maybe I do. Maybe I want to spend 30 years on the golf course, in which case, I'll live in a one-bedroom apartment and kind of put everything in my savings. And of course, there's a whole range in between. And then, of course, once I decide what kind of retirement I do or do not want, there's also how do I actually go about saving for it? Should I, for instance, invest in the markets right now? Should I actually spend all my money investing in my business and grow my business today and then start saving it down the road? There's all these choices, all this thinking, all these assessments that you would engage in if you were trying to make the best of your life in a free society. What does Social Security do? It wipes that out. It says, no, you don't get to plan and decide what kind of life you want to live and use your money accordingly. If you want to use that money to grow your business, too bad. If you don't actually want a retirement, too bad. We've decided that this is the kind of life you should live, and we're going to funnel you into it. Now, after you get put in this one-size-fits-all situation, I can go on to the next slide. Once you get put in this situation, is that the end of the story? What do you have once the government takes all your money and puts it into Social Security? Do you have a contractual right to that money at some later date? No. The courts have been very clear. The government, at any time it wants, for any reason, if it has the votes, it can change what you get. You don't have a right to a single solitary dime of what's supposedly invested on your account. What actually happens to your Social Security payments during your working years? So they go directly out into payments, and if there's anything left over, they get spent on other government programs and replaced with a little IOU that's worth exactly zero. That's your security. Your security is the promise of future politicians to loot current workers, your children and grandchildren. That's your guarantee that you'll have Social Security. Now, I don't think that's very secure, particularly when you're looking at a fiscal cliff of $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. So for any rational, productive, responsible person, Social Security is all downside. All downside. Completely 100% we're getting this, right? All downside. Who does benefit though? Who actually is who has a vested interest in Social Security? Well, I would say there's two groups. On the one hand, there's the person who is not rational, is not responsible, and who couldn't be bothered to think 4 days into the future, let alone 40 years. And on the other hand, there's also the politicians who get elected by appeasing that constituency. The people who have an interest in the entitlement state are not the unable, but the unwilling. That's not to say that only today everybody who benefits is unwilling or is immoral or has an entitlement mentality. No, the problem today is that a lot of good people are suckered into the system and made, in many cases, dependent on it. A lot of people who need Social Security today wouldn't have if they would have been able to keep those tens of thousands of dollars each year and save it and invest it on their own. So that's a real tragedy. But we can basically sum up this way. Anybody who does take responsibility for their lives, including the ambitious poor, the best system for them is one where they have the freedom to use their wealth as they see fit, and where other people around them have the right to use their wealth as they see fit. The entitlement state punishes the responsible person. The entitlement state rewards the irresponsible person. And that's why I say that the entitlement state is completely immoral and destructive. And that our goal, our long-term goal, needs to be to scrap it completely. To have a fully free society where you earn it, you keep it. Every last dime of it. So, how do we fight the entitlement state if we are so inclined to do it? Well, I'm just going to give a couple points to kind of indicate what I think is crucial. So the main thing to do is reject, at the very root, the whole entitlement narrative, the whole idea that these are necessary, virtuous programs, and replace it with the conviction and the commitment that no, the individual has a right to exist for his own sake and use his wealth for his own goals and his own dreams. That he doesn't have a right to reach into other people's pockets at the expense of their goals and their dreams. Second, focus on the individual. Focus on the individual. The argument against entitlements is not, well, it will increase GDP by this kind of figure, or it will stimulate the economy or something like that. No, the issue is, does your life belong to you or not? Does your life belong to you or not? We need to next reject concepts like the quote, the poor. Are there poor people? Yeah, absolutely there's poor people, but the poor treats it as if there's just this kind of collective where these people are indistinguishable, have everything in common. No, the only thing they have in common is they don't have a lot of money. But there's a big question of why don't they have a lot of money? Is it because they've not exercised their effort and ambition and intelligence? Or is it through bad luck? For the same reason, we need to reject concepts like the rich. Are they rich because they earned it? Well, that's great. And on a free market, basically the only way to get rich is to earn it. Are they rich because they got government favors and government handouts and government subsidies? There's a lot of rich farmers out there who make their living. There's even, quote, farmers who get a whole bunch of farming subsidies who don't actually farm anything. That's not something to admire. So again, we shouldn't lump everybody into this category of the, quote, the rich. And by the same token, we should be careful with concepts like ambitious, responsible, productive, makers and takers. These words have their place, but let's remember that most people don't fall fully into one or the other category. The goal of capitalism is not to spit in the face of this group who are the so-called takers. It's to punish taking and ban taking and free us to engage in making. So it's to focus on that. What freedom protects is a whole sphere of virtuous actions, and it punishes and bans destructive ones. If you are successful, don't apologize for earned wealth. You should be proud. If you earned it because you worked for it, you created that, you built that, then that's something you should be proud of. And you should be proud to say, I made my money and I earned every penny of it, and I'm going to use it to make my life on earth more enjoyable. We need to condemn wealth redistribution in the strongest moral terms. These are not, quote, well-intentioned programs that went wrong along the way. These are programs that tear from people's hands their hopes and their dreams. Finally, we need to focus on the positive alternative. My main goal in life is not to tear down entitlements. It's to create a system that protects individual freedom so that we can actually achieve something with our lives. We can be productive. We can go out there and build a business. We can find careers we're passionate about. We can use the wealth that we do earn to build better and better and more enjoyable lives for ourselves. We should fight for the positive that is capitalism and not just against these corrupt programs that interfere and restrict capitalism. What we need is a morally idealistic framework for freedom and for capitalism. That, and I'll end on this, that's really what I cover in the book I co-wrote with Yaron Brook, Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas End Big Government. What we do is we say, look, Ayn Rand has a 50-year track record of getting people excited about capitalism, of getting them to see free markets in a morally positive light. And at a time like this, when our economic freedom is eroding very, very quickly, we need more of that on the side of anybody who's concerned with stopping that trend. And so our book talks about how do we inject Ayn Rand's moral idealism on the side of free markets. And that's what we call the free market revolution. It's that moral idealism has always been on the side of people who want to fight to expand the power of the government. What do we say when a young person goes off to college and starts voting for liberal politicians? Oh, he's being idealistic. Ayn Rand turns that on its head. She puts moral idealism where it belongs, on the side of those who want to fight for the freedom of the individual. That is powerful, potent stuff, and we could use that today. So thank you, and I'll take your questions. Yes. Yeah, speak loudly, and I'll repeat it for the live stream.
Okay. Something that I just taught, I'm a professor at Miami Dade College, something I just taught was the idea of how certain professionals who had certain trades in the Middle Ages actually went out of the feudal walls and developed their own towns, sort of a Galt's Gulch, if you will. I won't get into the details of that because it's not really as professional as it may seem, but the idea was to create a community outside the feudal walls with their own limitations and all that. What would be, I guess, what would be the possibility of finding a piece of land and experimenting with the idea of a Galt's Gulch?
So the question to kind of shorten it, is there any way we can kind of, instead of trying to change laws, find a place that doesn't already have a government and we can kind of create one from scratch? I don't think that's a very practical solution. I know there's people who are actually trying to do that. I know one guy who's investing in one of these, I think some South American country where we have a lease from the government that's going to allow us to do this. And there's another, I think he's an economist who's come up with this idea of charter cities, which is basically the same thing, finding places that there may be a government, but there's no people there, and basically saying, can we get permission to cordon this off and create a new place from scratch? I don't think that's very practical. I've never seen it work. I think there's reasons why you would doubt that it would work. If somebody wants to do it with their own money, that's fine. My concern is with saving America, because I think we can do it, and I think it's the only practical way to do it. And frankly, I don't want to live in a place where there's 2,000 other people. I want to live in a real society, and today most people they share the ideas of the culture, and they approve of the policies that the government engages in. So I think that my focus is on fighting that fight. And if somebody wants to go ahead and do it, I'm not going to sit here and pontificate and say it's not possible. I just think it's not the panacea that some people, I think, expect it to be. I mean, part of the problem is, so you gave the example of in the Middle Ages, this in effect would happen in various ways. I mean, that's one of the things that I think has changed about today is to be off the grid, in effect. I mean, they went off the grid, really. And the thing is that that's not what the scenario would be today, which obviously, you knew from the way you set up your question. But I think if you can't convince people of the ideas, there's not really a better option. Some people have talked about something called seasteading, which is basically we create an island in the middle of the ocean, and then we'll live on that. You go live on that island. I like Southern California. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I saw your post on Facebook where somebody posted, and one of the things, by the way, he forwarded. And my question to him was, wait a second, you talk about entitlement, and you lump together Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and I assume also welfare and all that. Do you see them as really being in the same category, Medicare and Social Security, which are contributed to, and it's a benefit that basically you're paying all through your life, and then you get back when you need it? Are you comfortable putting that in the same category as welfare, which is really wealth redistribution, welfare and Medicaid, which is for the indigent?
Yeah, so the question is, am I incorrectly grouping together two different kinds of cases? So there's the kind of case of where we have the explicit purpose of the program is wealth redistribution, say something like Medicaid, which is medical care or medical coverage for the low-income people. Is it wrong to group that together with something like Medicare, which is the idea is supposed to be individuals pay into it during their working years and get the benefits later in life? No, I think that they do deserve to be grouped together. And I tried to indicate why a little bit in my talk. So the reality of Social Security is your money is that you pay right now. You're not paying for your care. You're paying for the current retirees. The government can say, well, no, it's for you're really guaranteeing yourself coverage later in life. Now, morally, you can say that there's a difference from the recipient's point of view. The recipient's basically saying, hey, I paid into it, now I'm getting something out. But as a factual matter, what has happened is that wealth was redistributed from him to retirees when he was a worker, and now it's being redistributed from workers to him when he's a retiree. And I don't think that it makes it, I think that it changes how we might judge him in certain ways, but it doesn't change the nature of the program, is that it's a wealth redistribution program. And there cannot be such a thing as a coercive program that you pay into and therefore have guarantee that you've earned. So how much do I want to go into this? Well, let me just give one kind of statistic that I think helps drive this home. The average American pays in somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 into Medicare during his working life. What does he get out of it today? Somewhere closer to $1 million. So there's no argument that with Medicare, oh, well, I earned it because I paid into it. Yeah, you paid into it and then you get a bonanza later in life. Now that's definitely not sustainable. Social Security is different. Social Security is actually going the opposite way, where people are getting less. But to me, that sounds like a reason to get rid of Social Security, not to say, hey, I paid into it and I'm getting less, so isn't that not that bad? No, that's really horrific. I mean, even with the economy and the downturn that it's done, you still would have been better off during those years investing in an index fund. So, no, I think that fundamentally there are redistribution programs, and that what we should want is the freedom to use your wealth as you see fit. And then people can prepare for retirement or for health care as they see fit. If you want, excuse me.
First of all, and two things, your explanation of, or your saying that entitlement, it's an entitlement because they're getting now what they put in for something else. That's just a technicality. That is just the same thing as if I loan the bank money and the bank pays me, the bank is really paying me with the money that they lend to somebody else. So that's just the mechanics of it. The bottom line is that I contributed to something, and it's even better shown in the Medicare part. In the Medicare part, you said that people get $1 million back. Some people don't get anything. That is the nature of risk management, the nature of insurance. Is you take the risk and you spread it among everybody. So just because in an insurance company, if I paid in $5,000 and I get back $50,000, that's not really entitlement. That is just the principle of risk management. So
there's basically it's an argument about how to conceptualize and categorize these programs, and the analogy, there was two analogies basically made. One is to the way that banking works, and then one is to the way that insurance markets work. The banking one, you can't use that analogy because banking is actually, in a certain way, a sui generis undertaking because of the nature of money and the fact, and the word is escaping me at the moment. Well, in any case, banking is unique in the way that money can be lent out, and in effect, the money supply can increase while the amount of physical money in the world has not. So you can't, there's not ever an analogy to anything else in the market that works that way. The analogy to insurance is also problematic. And the basic problematic point is that an insurance company, what does an insurance company do? So first of all, it's voluntary, right? So it's not snatching up a bunch of people's money and then saying, hey, I'll pay you back whatever I decide to pay you back, and you'll pay in whatever I tell you to pay in, and that's a really good setup, right? That's good for your life. No, they have to convince you that what you'll get back, that the risk that what you'll get back is worth what you're putting in. And if you disagree, you can go elsewhere. But what does it do once it gets the money? Does it just move money around like a Bernie Madoff on steroids? No, it invests the money in productive endeavors so that there's more money at the end of the day than there would have been otherwise. what you're dealing with when the government does it is that money is not invested, it is consumed. It's destroyed. That wealth that is taken from you when it's taxed is gone. And so these analogies, although you can say that there are certain similarities, that the goal, the explicit goal of something like Medicare is to in effect mimic the way that health insurance would work on a market. It is not insurance. It is a fundamentally different phenomenon because it is a phenomenon based on people's dictates rather than the free choices and voluntary choices of individuals in a market. So I think it's always crucial to separate those two. So we can draw analogies between them on certain elements, but we should never conflate them. All right, next question. And if I remember that darn word about banking, I will be so thrilled. I cannot believe that I've written on this. I think it's in the book. Wait, I thought I heard it. Fractional reserve. Yeah, thank you. All right, you get.
It comes from Tim on live stream.
All right, thank you, Tim. Yes.
I have a question about education. I'm a big Ayn Rand fan, but I recently read in an interview that she supported private education over public education as a public school teacher and the product of a public school education and a child of poor parents. I'd like to know how do you serve that population, because it's not their fault that a child is born into that situation.
No, I'm glad you asked that, because that's actually one of my passions and something that I'm definitely going to be working on as a primary focus in the future. So the question, if you didn't hear it, was the issue of education, in particular what happens to people from low-income backgrounds in a situation where there is no government schooling, which is what Ayn Rand advocates, and definitely what I advocate. So, I mean, the basic issue, it's a similar phenomenon to what we've been talking about in the context of healthcare or retirement. It's that the primary obligation for paying for an education is the parent's responsibility. After all, who pays for most education now? It's the parents, primarily through property taxes. Now, in the system I advocate, you wouldn't be paying those property taxes. Government spending wouldn't be taking up so much of your money, and so most people would be able to afford the education of their children. Moreover, in the kind of society I advocate, people would be making a lot more money. And further, the cost of private education would not be what it is today. The reason it's so high today is precisely because the government's wiped out a real market in education. You can't have a real market where it's dominated by one so-called competitor who can give something away for free and you have to charge for it. And by the way, your customers, they also have to pay for the other people going to the government schools. Like does not a market make. So we're dealing with a radically different economic situation to start with than we are today. Nevertheless, will there be people who could not afford it? It's hard to imagine even that scenario. If you go into places like India and Africa today, there's a book called Beautiful Tree by, I think his name, it's not Peter O'Toole, it's something O'Toole. He actually goes into these places and he observes something very fascinating. These are the poorest parts of some of the poorest countries on earth. And in both, particularly India is the one that I've read more on. In India, there is government-provided free education. And yet in the slums of India, there is an incredible amount and diverse amount of private education for these people who are poor by World Bank standards, living on dollars a day. Why? Why are these parents, some of them are free, some of them are just very, very, very cheap. Why are parents struggling to do that? Because they want better for their kids and because they see that the government schools aren't doing a good job. And so if they can do it in the slums of India, the fact that would people not be able to do that in America today, and certainly in a future where our standard of living has gone through the roof? Well, it's possible that there will be people in that position. Now, what will happen then? Again, I would say the same elements that happened that we've talked about. Look at today. Today, the government it spends billions and billions and billions of dollars on government education. How much philanthropic money is spent on top of that in education? Billions and billions of dollars. Even in a context where the government's already spending billions, Americans, we value education so much, and we don't just value our education and our children's education. We want to live in an educated world. We know that we benefit, and so one of the major ways that we try to create that society is that successful Americans have consistently put their money where their self-interest is, their long-term self-interest, and they've helped, tried to improve the government, schools, and so on. In a freer system, I don't think there's any question that a lot of that money would be directed towards scholarships and making education even free for people of low incomes. Look, Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, the founder of Facebook, he just gave, I think it was $100 million to help improve government schools.
He hasn't done that. He promised, he has not. That was going to New Jersey in particular. He has not done.
Okay, but there are people who have, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt that he will, well, except that his stock's taking a hit. So I think the worry there is not very high. But let's look at the other side of it. Ayn Rand's argument is not that, hey, we can match the government schools, we'll just have to do it privately. No, I think it's much more tragic than that. I think, and I apologize because you do teach at the government schools, so don't take any of this personally. But I think they are a disaster that have failed to educate American students. And it is such an outrage, the complete destruction of education. My wife's a teacher. She works at a private school, and I've seen these kids. Now, you can say it's a biased sample because many of them come from higher level backgrounds. But the key thing is not that it's private, it's that they approach curriculum radically differently than American schools do. If you look at what happened to American schools, I mentioned how the progressives were responsible for creating the entitlement state. The progressives, in particular John Dewey, but there were others, they radically changed the curriculum in schooling during the end of the 19th, but primarily the 20th century. And they basically, their agenda consisted of, at the preschool and kindergarten level, completely wiping out a focus on learning to read, on learning any skills, and making it all about the child just does whatever he feels like. He should learn to be a member of the group. John Dewey said we shouldn't teach children how to read until they're 8, and if they start trying to learn it on their own, we should do everything that we can to stop them. Then during the later years, we basically the progressives tried to destroy the academic curriculum, the focus on math, on foreign languages, on history. And in many ways, they succeeded. Now, they didn't get everything that they wanted. So today you'll find, well, we don't really have history. Usually it's social studies, which is, again, a product of the progressives. But the method by which students learn to read, do they get history? How much of a focus is there on science? How do they teach science? I think it's been so degraded. I'll just give you one concrete example. It used to be that when you learned to read, American students got what were called, they were readers, and McGuffey Reader is the most famous one that you may have heard of. And it had the classics of literature in it, some of the great poems of humanity, really hard stuff. These kids were reading, today's high schoolers, they couldn't read. But not only were they reading it, which illustrates that they were so much more advanced than our kids today, it was exciting to read because here was the great works of the human mind. When the progressives came in, they had a different theory of teaching reading. They got rid of phonics and they said, let's have this look-say method or this whole language method, and we'll teach kids how to memorize common words instead of sounding them out. And so they created a reader that was not the McGuffey Reader. It was, you'll probably have heard of this, the See Jane Run series. You know that, here's Jane. See Jane Run. Well, they had to use this simple stuff because the kids had to memorize the words on the page. They couldn't just sound them out. And so what did this do? Well, first of all, there was a lot of kids couldn't learn how to read because this method was completely, what's a polite word for BS? Complete BS. But the other tragic part is, to the extent they could read, who would want to? If you're reading just see Dick run and see Jane run and, you know, see them tumble down the hill or whatever the heck they're doing, nobody wanted to read after that. So the fact is that the quality of education has been destroyed, and the reason that it's been destroyed is precisely because there hasn't been a market. There is no reason why we shouldn't have a Silicon Valley of education. Education should be filled with the same kind of innovation, quality increases that we see with iPhones. The fact that we don't have a Silicon Valley of education is because there's no competition in education, because there's no freedom in education, because there's no market in education. I mentioned that my wife works at this school. The results that they're achieving, if they were achieving it on a market, a whole bunch of competitors would be running out and replicating it all across the land. But that doesn't happen. When schools find cool things to do and new things to do, it doesn't proliferate because, again, no market. So, and that's not even to get into issues, teachers' unions and things. Are there good teachers in the schools? Yes, but they're actually very constrained in what they can do. One of the basic problems that you see in education, and you know, you can correct me if this doesn't apply, but it I think applies at a lot of schools, is there's a tension between an administration that feels powerless to set a goal, set direction, and set a vision for the school, and the teachers who are professionals who want real independence. How does a market solve it? Different schools attack it different ways. Some schools will have a very strong administration. Some schools, like my wife's school, will have a philosophy, and then you focus on hiring the right people and just, you know, checking in once in a while. There would be all these different approaches. But in a government system, it ends up to be clashing warfare too often, and the people who pay the price are students. So that's why I say the more that you value education, the more you should value free markets. And as an aside, good teachers in a free market would make a ton more money than they make today. Remember, there are no stupid questions, only stupid questioners. All right, go ahead.
Can you tell me a little bit about what your assessment is about what's going to happen when more and more baby boomers start retiring?
So the question is, how is this entitlement crisis going to play out? Because as more and more baby boomers retire, there's fewer and fewer workers supporting more and more people who are primarily consuming. I'm not a good prognosticator. I don't even play one on TV. So the most I'll say is this, that at some point, and almost certainly within the next 10 to 15 years, there reaches a point at which something has to happen, either economically or politically. What will happen will depend on the ideas and the culture. Do I think Americans will be convinced that we should scrap the entitlement state in 10 to 15 years? Probably not. That's not what needs to happen. What needs to happen is that they need to at least be on the premise that there's something morally dubious about these, and there's better possibilities out there. And if we can start to move the needle back, we can at least keep an economy alive long enough so that long term people can be convinced that a fully free system could work and would be morally superior. But the problem is that right now we don't have that kind of time. We don't have a lot of time to start moving the needle back. So what will happen, I honestly don't know. I'm an optimist, but yeah, we'll see. Yes, sir.
How do you get people to think along your lines? You've got an entitlement state where people are being paid, they think, for sitting home doing nothing. And politicians buy their votes. It's a fact today in our society, 47% of the people in this country do not pay income tax. Yet they have federal income tax. Yet they have the same right as the other 53% to say what happens to the money collected by the productive people in this society. You haven't addressed that. that it's nice to say, let's get rid of the entitlement state, but how do you go about doing that?
So the question is, how can I overcome the barrier, which I mean, seems really hard to overcome, that a lot of people are gaining these benefits? Well, in part, I tried to answer that when I responded to this lady's comments. People don't vote their pocketbooks. Not as a rule. Oh, no, and that's what I mean, that's the California example. People will vote themselves.
California is a separate entity.
If only. If only. No, people vote morality, certainly in the long term. The reason why we voted for entitlements is not primarily that people are voting for entitlements for themselves. It's so that they felt they've done their duty to everybody else. Do some people? Yeah, absolutely. Now, I don't think it's 47%. We have to remember that statistic, it's certainly true that 47% don't pay federal income taxes. But they pay a bunch of other taxes, and who is part of that differs year to year. If you're a businessman and you have a bad year, you're part of that 47 supposedly unproductive percent. If you're a student who's getting ready for college, getting ready to enter a productive career, you're part of that 47%. If you're a person who just, lost your job, or who is, productive but not, you don't make a lot of money because you're not that skilled.
You still have the right to say what happens to the rest of the people's money.
Right, but my point is this. My point is that those are productive people, and that most of those people hold the view that I want to live in a system where I'm successful, I can enjoy my success. I think it's a very common attitude. I don't believe that there's 47% who are just, because they don't pay federal income taxes, are going to vote for a constant expansion of the entitlement state. I think that it's primarily a function of a person's ideas, and that a person's ideas are a product of their free will, their choice to think about the issue or not, and that their economic situation. Look, I'm not a Marxist. I don't think that a person's economic status at any given time determines his or her ideas. Your ideas are up to you, and people choose to look at reality, then they can reach different conclusions.
When the average man on the street thinks that socialism is, the definition of socialism is being nice to other people and socializing and talking about problems that people have. This is what you're talking about? That doesn't make sense.
So there's a couple points. So yeah, it's really hard, but there's not another option. It's been done before the other way. The left, in a space of a couple generations, transformed this country. Look, if you go back to even as recent as the Depression, and now this is the Depression, people are really struggling, really suffering. There were handouts available even early on, but most people weren't taking them. And Roosevelt, we actually know, he was really concerned about this. He goes, Americans are too proud to be on the dole. And indeed, there was a saying at the time that was very popular, which is, I'd rather be dead in a ditch than on the dole. Because, yeah, I could get that money, but what kind of person would I be?
You didn't have the entitlement mentality.
That's right. But that entitlement mentality wasn't created just or even primarily by the creation of entitlements. It was created by people who preached an ideology of entitlement. It was because look, even by the time you got to the 1960s, it was true that most people who were eligible for welfare weren't taking it. During the 60s, you saw welfare rolls shoot up even as the economy was improving. Why did it shoot up? It shot up because the left made a specific goal of going into poor communities and telling them, you shouldn't be ashamed to be on the dole. You know what you should be ashamed about? Working hard and only getting a little bit of money. If you're just shining shoes and making a few dollars an hour, that's shameful. It's not shameful to be in the dole. In other words, they changed their ideas. There's no reason that those ideas cannot be changed again.
They bought their votes.
No, but they didn't buy it. My point is that they preached a morality that made it acceptable in order to take those dollars. But if people's ideas are changed, no, it's not acceptable to live that way. And I still think most Americans hold that view. They just feel conflicted about it. Look, if you look at a lot of the people who are taking government handouts, what do they say? A lot of them actually don't like it. One of the things they say is, well, look, if I just reject it, that money's still going to go out there. It's not going to go back to its original owners. So why should I be the sucker who doesn't take it? it's not going to make a difference. People will often follow the path of least resistance. And so those people will not fight tooth and nail against creating a more just system where that money isn't taken and redistributed in the first place. When that redistribution is occurring, yeah, they'll join in the party, but the people the core issue is that are the thoughtful people in the culture, the people who influence policy, the core group of politically engaged, active, thinking Americans. What do they believe? And I don't believe that that's determined by their economic status. But that doesn't make it easy. Yes?
From a legislative point of view, what would you suggest that Congress do in order to deal with the retiring baby boom generation? They're not going to deal with their entitlements. What kind of bill, what kind of policy would you suggest we enact? Because ultimately it has to go that way.
So the question is basically, Don, nobody's ever going to agree with you, at least not in the short term, right? So what should they do? Now, there's a certain part of me wants to say, look, I don't say, all right, now that we've rejected the moral and practical solution, what garbagey solution should we accept? But I'll give you a garbagey solution that would at least buy us time. I mean, basically, there's some key things you could do that would save the economy from crisis and then buy you time to engage in this long-term program of convincing people that we just talked about. First of all, you means test everything. Social Security, Medicare, it becomes only programs for people in need. Now it would probably go to, when we means test today, it would probably go to basically everybody making under $250,000 a year. But the point is that you would cut out payments to people who, quote, didn't need them as much as you could politically get away with.
Does that go against your philosophy?
Yeah, I'm giving what I think is the immoral, garbagey short-term solution that might be politically feasible. That would save us from an immediate crisis, economic crisis. The next thing that you would do is you would voucherize. You know, Paul Ryan doesn't like the word, but basically you make it, instead of defined benefits, you have defined contributions. So the same way that in business it used to be that you get a pension, and then it became clear that's not very, it makes no sense to do that, both from the business's perspective and from the recipient. Because if I'm the recipient, now I have to worry about the rest of my life that business will go out of business. So we changed to defined contribution to 401ks and things like that. That's what you would do for things like Medicare. So instead of basically saying you can use infinity health care and the government will reimburse you some portion of that, you say, no, you get X number of thousands of dollars to go out there in the market and buy health insurance. I think those, and then raise the retirement age, lower benefits slightly. That whole grab bag would kind of tide us over for a little while, but it doesn't change fundamentally the moral and economic corruption of the programs. So that's my solution that I hope we don't follow. Yes?
This entitlement morality, or lack of morality, that seems to be a result of the people's philosophy. The people, it's something that's within you, right? 50 years ago, people would rather die than take a handout. Now, on the radio, it's like, don't pay your debts, consumer credit counseling. You have the guy with the dollar signs, get money from the government on TV. It's the mentality. How have we gotten to this? That's one thing. And I guess it's an aside, but to think that the lack of morality being taught in school, this thing that anything goes, it's a free-for-all, but you think that has something to do with it? Maybe that the lack of religion, although I hate throwing the religion in there, but religion does have some kind of morality guideline that we have lost in the past, 30, 40 years.
So the question is really about the decline in morality, which has played a role in kind of unleashing the entitlement state. I think that's definitely true that there's been that decline. I think the way that it was able to play out is that from the beginning in this country, there was a conflict between two kinds of moral approaches. And basically you can think of it as Greece versus Rome. There was the Greek influence, the individualist, pro-happiness influence, pro-individual responsibility strain in America. And there was the church influence. There was the religious influence, which was the idea, I am my brother's keeper. And both these elements were basically part of America from the start, but they don't go together. You can't combine, in the end, you can't combine the idea that your life belongs to you and that it belongs to anybody who has a need, that it belongs to society. And so that conflict, there's always been that tension. And what happened over the course of the 19th and really primarily the 20th century is that in that conflict, the view of the individual pursuing his own happiness, well, we started to review that as immoral and selfish. And so we started to try to chip away at that and emphasize the idea of we are our brother's keeper. This is what Ayn Rand called the conflict between egoism and altruism. And the problem, and so that's why we got this move away from an individual responsibility society into a collective responsibility society. But part of what happens then is that you can't actually live by that moral idea that I am my brother's keeper. Nobody can live by it because the more consistently you try to practice it, the worse your life gets. And so what people do as a protective measure is they discard morality altogether and they try to live their lives without moral guidance. You know, they refer to morality once in a while when they feel guilty or, you know, if it comes to lying to somebody. But it doesn't play an ongoing role in the formation of their character and lives. And so, yeah, we've seen a disintegration of morality, but not because of lack of religion, but because of too much religion. If you had a morality that actually gave you guidance in how to make the most of your life, if you got a real moral education, which is what I advocate, then you would have a very strong moral character and there wouldn't be that need that people feel to run away from morality so they can actually live and try to enjoy life on this earth. Now, part of the reason that I advocate getting rid of government schools and private education is that I don't think that you should be forced to pay for the ideas that you disagree with, and I don't think I should be forced to pay for schools and send my kid to schools that preach ideas that I disagree with, so that you can have a school that has a kind of ideological and moral education that you approve of for your child. But I definitely think there's been that disintegration of morality, but it's not. But the solution is to really rethink morality, and that's the argument of my book. My book looks at what a different approach to morality might look like. What a different approach to thinking about what kind of life one should live would look like. And that is really what Ayn Rand defines in her books. Alex.
Several live stream questions.
Sure.
The first one from Kevin. What signs, if any, make you hopeful about our political future?
What signs, if any, make me hopeful about our political future? Basically only one. And it's mixed. But it's very positive, and that's the Tea Party. The fact that there was a rebellion and a revolt against the growth of government, and that it was a revolt that really had a moral backbone to it, not fully, but there was a real sense of what you're doing is wrong, and what we should do is go back to the founders' vision. Now, do they understand the founders' vision? Do they understand how it applies to specific issues like Social Security, Medicare, government regulation? Not really. Certainly not all of them. Do they have some bad elements like an anti-immigration strain? Yeah, they do. But they're fundamentally a good movement, a movement that it wants to move in the direction of economic freedom. So that's, I think, a hopeful sign. It means that there is the what Ayn Rand called the American sense of life left. There are elements of that idea of don't tread on me, don't push me around. I want to live my life and be happy, and your job is to protect my rights and get out of the way. There's some of that spirit, but what it needs is ideological guidance. And to shamelessly plug my book once again, it was really written for that audience. So it's primarily targeted at people who maybe have read Ayn Rand, maybe not, but they're primarily kind of the Tea Party reader who they want to move in a different direction, but they need guidance on what that direction would look like, and then the kind of arguments that are needed to get there.
We have another question from Tim.
All right.
What time frame would you give for the rollback of the entitlement state?
Well, that question could be asked in different ways, so I'll answer it in the most controversial way, which is,
What was the question?
oh, I'm sorry. So the question is, what time frame would I give for the rollback of the entitlement state? So I take it to mean not when I think it will happen, because as I said, I'm not a prognosticator. But let's say that I convinced Americans that, yes, this is the direction we should go, and then it was a question of how do we get there from here? Basically, my solution would be you scrap every entitlement program overnight, and you have one. And it's based purely on need, say here's the minimum standard of living and you get $10,000 or whatever. You have that for 5 years and people are on notice. At the end of that 5 years, that's gone too. Make plans accordingly. Yes?
Dr. Harry Bigswanger actually thought about rolling back. He talks about these ideas about rolling back the GDP to last year's, and then the year before, because we can prove for a fact there were no starving people in the streets in 2009, or 2008, or 2007, and you can go all the way back to 1991, 1981, and that's how he proposes that idea.
Yeah, no, so there's definitely different approaches, and one approach that he just mentioned is basically you just keep rolling back to previous year's spending, because look, we know that even 20, 30 years ago, there was not this kind of mass starvation and death in the streets. Life was quite all right. I think polemically that's probably more appealing than my 5-year plan. But there's different approaches. But the key thing is, the real issue is though that you can't even get that plan unless people are convinced that the end state is a proper goal. So the challenge is getting them to accept the goal. And then how do we get there? That's much less of an issue. You still can have some debate about that, and there'll be some some ways that make more sense than others. And I'm not tied to any particular plan. Basically, the only rules is it can't be overnight, and it can't take too darn long. But within there, I think there's a lot of room for debate.
If I may interject just one more time, having to do with public schools, because the young lady talked about it. One thing that I agree upon, and I teach at a public school, at a college, public college, and one thing that I agree upon, that I had found agreement upon, whether it's a conservative view or a liberal view, is that we both want the government out of it in telling us what to do.
Yeah,
So that's my starting point with anybody I have a discussion with as far as like, so how do we fix education? Well, let's take those people out of it. And let's decide how we can do this. That's how we built that idea of competition, ideas, period.
Yeah, so just for the live stream, the gentleman gave some points on how to fix education that I won't repeat because I think we're getting near to the end of our time.
Still have 1 minutes.
Okay, so we'll keep going for a while longer. Yes?
When you ask about what your plan is for the entitlements that are out now, and you mentioned wiping them out, what about the people that are actually disabled? What plan would there be for them? What would be your plan?
Right, so the question is, what about the disabled? And that's, again, what I tried to cover in my talk, is that what I think my plan would be, I'm not a central planner who gets to tell people what the plan should be. That is for them, their loved ones, and anybody who cares about them to decide. So in a free society, I promise you, nobody will stop you from helping anybody you think is worthy of help. Now I should add, we tend to equate disabled with unable to support themselves, but we should at least remember that is not at all the case. I think I've definitely read and seen stuff by some really inspiring people who have no arms, no legs, and not just make a living, but do really well for themselves because they're willing to go out there, and they might have to work harder than other people. It might be more challenging. They might face more obstacles, but they overcome them through sheer determination. I'll give you another example. At the shopping center I go to, there's a guy there who is in there every single day bagging groceries. He's obviously mildly retarded, but I see him every day walking past my house to work. A lot of these people that we just assume, well, you know, we'll lump them in this category of disabled, they're able to support themselves, and the number who literally can't is very, very small. Thankfully. I mean, if it were any other way, human beings would have never survived this long. Yes?
I just think as a follow-up to that, there's a confusion between the morality of altruism and the virtue of benevolence. People tend to confuse them. And one is a very proper way for man to act, whereas continuing with the morality of an altruistic approach is self-defeating.
Yeah, so the comment was that there's a distinction between a morality that says somebody's need is an entitlement and the desire to help somebody when it's of no sacrifice to yourself. And that's certainly true. It raises complex issues that I won't go into. We go into more in the book what that distinction is and why it's so important. But it's definitely true that the desire to help somebody per se doesn't put you in the category of saying that a person's need is a moral entitlement. And to look at it the other way, rejecting the idea that somebody's need is a moral entitlement doesn't mean that you don't care about other people and you're not willing to help them under certain circumstances. Yes?
What happens when people don't do what they're supposed to do? You talk about insurance. You tell people, yeah, you have to, private insurance is fine, get private insurance. What happens when they don't get the insurance and they show up at a hospital? What happens when people don't save for old age and they're starving? Do you give them a gun and say, here, pull the trigger, or?
So the question is, what happens under my system to people who make bad decisions?
Exactly.
They can't impose their bad decisions on people who make good decisions. If you think, well, they should still be helped anyway, again, nobody will stop you from helping them. And indeed, it has always been the case that hospitals, they have always provided for people who've shown up and cannot pay. That's always been the case. The reason we got Medicare and Medicaid is not because people weren't receiving care. It was because it was the major argument that was offered was that, well, it's degrading that they should have to come hat in hand. But I say morally, it's way preferable they come hat in hand than gun in hand. Yes?
Things that the government has gotten involved in particular medical costs. If you plot medical costs through the years, you'll find that medical costs rose and fell along with the gross national product of other goods and services in our society. There wasn't any extreme jumps, except in 1967, I believe it was. And what happened in 1967?
So the question was that in general, there haven't been any extraordinary spikes in healthcare costs except in 1967, and what happened there?
Well, Medicare came about. All of a sudden, people were not responsible for their own medical bills. There was a third party picking up the cost of your medical bills. Doctors became multi-millionaires overnight with treating older people that would come in. They would give them every test under the sun. They would get their piece of it. Medical costs rose tremendously. And when you think that's a technical field, in all other technical fields, progress has reduced the cost and increased the quality of any product that you've ever bought, except in the medical field. And it's because government is involved in it. Anytime the government is involved, you have high costs, you have a situation that is difficult to get out of.
Excuse the market, totally.
How impressed would you be if I could repeat that whole thing? No, but he basically made some really good points. And basically he answered the question that he set up for himself, and I think quite eloquently, is that the basic reason that we've seen prices operating so weirdly and destructively in the healthcare sector is precisely that it's a sector dominated by government. We have a whole chapter on healthcare in the book where we go into just that phenomenon. But just to give you one example that I think is very striking, the sectors of the healthcare market that are not dominated by government, where insurance isn't used to pay for them, people pay out of pocket, say LASIK and plastic surgery, they don't experience that spiraling cost and lack of innovation that we see in these other fields. And I think that's one indication, although not a full proof, that if you didn't have the government paying all the bills and engaging in so much control of the healthcare industry, it would look a lot better and be a lot better for us, not actually more out of our reach. Yes?
I have a question about the two-party system, what your views are on that. My issue with the Republican Party is religion, that it's always kind of in the forefront, and I don't have a religion, and I don't think it has anything to do with politics. Why can't there be, or feasibly, a third party that says, we're only going to talk about business, not all this other stuff?
So the question is, why are we stuck with two parties and neither one is particularly good? Which I agree with. I mean, I think, and I actually agree with exactly the aspect that you mentioned. I think there's other problems too, but the fundamental problem with the Republican Party today is precisely that they have made religion part of their political agenda explicitly. And we saw this in the debates. Now, I'm a representative of a 501c3 nonprofit, so I can't endorse particular candidates or particular bills. But I think it's very clear, one of the most despicable things I've heard in recent memory was the answer that Paul Ryan gave on abortion at the last debate. Set aside the issue of abortion, which has complexities to it. But the way he started it was by saying, I don't think a politician can divorce his private religious views from the way he governs. You better damn well think that he can and constitutionally must. And to say that he is going to inject his religious views, and of all people, Biden, his best answer of the night by far was saying, I don't think I have a right to govern and impose my religious views on other people. That is what separation of church and state means. And now the Republicans have thrown that out explicitly. They said there's not freedom from religion, there's only freedom for religion, i.e. freedom for religious people to impose their religion on other people. And then it's just which religion gets to impose it. That is not freedom. The separation of church and state means that the government's job is to protect our freedom, and that includes our intellectual freedom. And if you want to be religious and if you want to try to convince other people to be religious, that's fine. But you can't inject religious views into the way you govern. Unfortunately, I don't think that the solution can be create a third party. Because the reason that those are the two parties is because that's what most people believe. And I think there's a reason why no third party has been able to do anything except for undermine the party nearest to it in elections. The solution is, I think, now it doesn't mean that there could never be a third party that would be good. Some people wondered, and we still don't know, will the Tea Party in effect evolve into a third party that focuses on economic issues? It could, that kind of thing could happen. I think it's a little bit of wishful thinking. But there's definitely a division within there's several divisions, but there is a division within the Republican Party. Unfortunately, I don't think the division is so much people who do and don't want to impose religion as it's people who want to be better on economic issues and impose religion, which is, a disaster in the making. So unfortunately, I'm generally an optimist, but there I have no good advice to offer or no hope to offer at all. The only hope is convincing one of the parties to move in a better direction. I haven't heard. I haven't heard from you.
Well, I was just going to say that I've also heard the same question asked as to why aren't there more parties? And one of the responses I've heard is that you get into a situation like they have in Europe, where you have lots of parties. You have like 20, 30 parties in one central government, and then they have to start making coalitions. But then say you need like 10 people in your coalition to form a majority, you have to turn to parties like a Nazi party or a communist party, whose views are so far out, and they're being represented by people in the country, but it's not anything that they want. And those smaller factions hold too much power over the majority, because by being part of that coalition, they can say, oh, well, if you're not going to do things our way, we're just going to leave and you're not going to be able to get anything done.
Yeah, so the question is, as bad as our two-party system is, might it not be better than a coalition system, which is really the only alternative? I haven't studied the matter. That's plausible to me. On the other hand, those kinds of factions, just what they do today is they exist within the two major political parties. So does it keep really, really bad radicals out or lessen them or lessen their influence? Maybe, but if a vote is going to be swayed by a marginal number of candidates, that gives any one given representative, that gives any given one of them an incredible amount of power, even if he does hold views outside the mainstream. So I'd want to study it more, but it's plausible to me, and I don't think it is going to change. I think for better or for worse, for our lifetimes, this is more or less what we're stuck with. It's how do we change the dial in terms of the policies that are going to be advocated. Yes?
This is a town hall, and I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to give my 2 cents on this. But I firmly believe that the notion of separation of church and state, that you're not applying it correctly as the founding fathers intended it to be in our Constitution. If you look at the history of where that came from, it was actually a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Indian Baptists of Connecticut, and he was ensuring them that there shall be a wall of separation between the church and state, such that the government will not infringe upon the liberties of the church to influence their government. George Washington.
Okay, I'm actually going to cut you off. No, I'm going to answer your charge, but this is not a town hall. This is my forum, so I'm going to answer.
That's what you said earlier.
No, I said tonight there's a debate, which is a town hall style debate among the presidents. So, but his view, what he's saying is that I have a wrong view of separation church and state. I'm going to have to correct the record that he's setting up. The fact is that the separation of church and state as an idea came down to the founders from a philosopher. And it was the philosopher John Locke, who in his letter concerning toleration outlines exactly what separation of church and state means. And what Locke says, and now Locke was the most influential figure on the Founding Fathers' political ideas by far, and that's not a controversial view. What Locke said is exactly what I said, which is the government's role is to protect individual rights, which means the freedom of the mind, and that therefore you have to take power, political power, out of the hands of the church, and you have to take away from the government the power to control religious thinking. And that includes the rejection of religion. And so that is the framework that influenced the Founding Fathers. Now, it's true that the phrase, the separation of church and state, was from a letter of Thomas Jefferson. It is an analogy, but it is an analogy that accurately captures the essence of Locke's position, the position that the majority, although not all, the Founding Fathers agreed with. The main founder to read in this issue, by far, is actually not Thomas Jefferson, but James Madison. Read Madison's, what's the title of it? Well, if you just Google Madison and religion, he wrote one major essay on it that actually he used in order to pass Jefferson's bill on religious freedom in Virginia. And that lays out a very Lockean view in the context of the Founding Fathers. So I would suggest stop studying religious fanatics who tell you how to interpret this idea and study the actual Founding Fathers. No, I'm going to cut this off because this is not the topic for tonight. But if people want to read further, start with Locke and Madison. Any final live stream questions? Yeah, memorial and remonstrance, But that it usually just goes by that title. That's great. I got to carry these people with me everywhere. Just every time I'm trying to remember something, they can tell me.
Question from Terry in live stream. How do you stay so positive? I just finished DIM.
So the question is, how do I stay positive? And he references a new book that came out by actually the founder of the Ayn Rand Institute, where I work, Leonard Peikoff, called The Dim Hypothesis. And what Dr. Peikoff does is argue that we can project cultural trends if we look at certain facets of a culture that we don't often look at. And it's complex, what he actually does, but very illuminating. But the bottom line is that he argues that we're headed for basically a religious form of dictatorship in a few generations from now. That's the direction this country's headed in, and it paints a pretty bleak picture. I can't speak to DIM itself. I've read it once, and it deserves a very careful thought. I'm optimistic because I think that we still have enough freedom to advocate for the right ideas, and I think that the right ideas are true, and so that people can come to see them. I think looking at the history of how America was transformed before, I think our side can take advantage of those lessons in a way that gives us a massive amount of power to take a small number of people and have outsized influence. I mean, look, the progressives transformed America. They did not have that many people on their side. It was a core group of committed people who were morally idealistic and philosophically armed to the teeth. Well, if that don't describe our side. Now, I still think the numbers that we have are they're smaller than small. So the work is cut out for us. But the fact is that that so long as there's a chance, I'm not going to worry too much about how small that chance is. You fight because the alternative is you give up, and I would never give up. Well, and that will end.